anyhow, Art, if you'll do that, his lovely wife is with him today to see this presentation and approve it. Zipporah is her name, and so thank you for coming.
Well, again, Bill, thank you for inviting me. I love these opportunities to talk about history because I don't think enough of we Americans really appreciate how we got to where we are. And even though Midway doesn't play necessarily into how we got to where we are, it is part of the fabric of our tradition, and it is an important aspect of the battle in the Pacific, probably one of the most important battles fought between 1941 and 1945 when the Japanese surrendered. The presentation I'm going to take you through, it's long and it's detailed, and I'll explain why. I've lifted this off of a presentation I did on June 5th at the Battle of Midway commemoration ceremony down at the Arizona State Capitol Museum. It was the fourth commemoration of Midway, and one of the interesting things that we were confronted with was why would Arizona care about the Battle of Midway, for gosh sakes? It's a landlocked state. Why do we care about a naval battle? Well, we have a long connection with the Battle of Midway. Midway was the first major payback by the United States for the for the Pearl Harbor attack. Midway resulted in the sinking of 4 of the 6 Japanese aircraft carriers that participated in the attack on Pearl Harbor. So it was a major payback for the United States. When you look statistically at what Pearl Harbor meant to the state of Arizona, the USS Arizona was the flagship of the Pacific Fleet. Almost half of the casualties that day at Pearl Harbor were the dead on the USS Arizona. She boasted a crew of 1,177. 1,102 Navy and Marine personnel were killed when the Arizona exploded and sank. 229 bodies ultimately were recovered, and more than 900 are still entombed in the Arizona. That makes the Battle of Midway not just a point of interest for the state of Arizona, but a very important connection for the state. In 2012, an unofficial census was done, and it was determined that 10% of the United States Navy personnel come from Arizona. The Navy boasts an enrollment of about 40,000, and that means about 4,000 sailors are Arizonans. So there's more than just a minor connection between Arizona and the United States Navy. I guess you might say Arizonans will do anything to get out of the heat, and joining the Navy is an option. Also, we have 3 major veterans with connections to Arizona. Ensign John C. Butler died at the Battle of Midway, and we're going to talk a little bit about him as we get through the presentation. Also, Radioman Henry Height, who just passed away last year, was on board the USS Portland, which was one of the major ships instrumental in recovering personnel from the Yorktown as she was abandoned on June 6 and 7. And then Jack Holder, who I believe appeared here for one of your meetings, and God bless him, is still with us at age 93, was on a PBY Catalina that morning, searching for the Japanese fleet. He's a Pearl Harbor survivor. He was there that morning of the attack. And so Arizona has more than a passing interest in what happened with the Battle of Midway. When you think about the Battle of Midway, some major thoughts come to mind, and we're going to explore these. I was talking to a gentleman before we started about the history of the battle, and over 60 books have been written about the battle since it occurred in 1942. And there's so much that's been said that's either been an appreciation of the time when the book was written or the film was made, until now, that really studying the Battle of Midway is an investigative process that it takes a fair amount of effort to understand. Instead of it being a miracle, Actually, it was a gross miscalculation on the part of the Japanese, and we're going to examine that. It was born of overconfidence by the Japanese. They had experienced a phenomenal first 6 months in the war following Pearl Harbor, and they came to believe that they couldn't be defeated, and they were suffering from something that they themselves call victory disease. The Japanese, because of their culture, are rigidly adherent to authority, and so the opportunity among the leadership of the Japanese to question their strategies and their approaches just was something they wouldn't do, and it facilitated and contributed to their defeat at Midway. There were also inherent technological and operational shortcomings that Midway brought to light that were always there, but the Japanese never were combating an enemy that was fully prepared to deal with them. And this was the first time. Midway was the first time that the Japanese combated an opponent who was ready on equal footing to deal with them, and it showed up these operational and technological shortcomings that were hidden, and we're going to talk about those too. It brings to mind unrelenting bravery on the part of the American personnel who fought in the battle. 130 men died, which their lives, they sacrificed their lives in furtherance of defeating the Japanese. And they were unrelenting in their attempt to do that, and we're going to explore that as well. It also brings to mind lost opportunities, how the Japanese had the opportunity to defeat the American Navy, but they failed to see that opportunity when it presented itself. Also, it's a classic story of bad timing, and it's a dose of pure chance and luck, both good and bad. If you're going to understand why the Battle of Midway, we need to really study first what was the state in the Pacific when the battle, just before the battle took place, and the events leading up to the battle. So let's review that. As I said, the Japanese had a string of phenomenal victories beginning in December 7th with the attack on Pearl Harbor. At the same time that Pearl Harbor was taking place, they moved on the Philippines. They also had a task force that was moving on Malaya. They walked into French Indochina because they were allies with the Germans, and when the Germans overran France in May 1940, the Germans very graciously gave French Indochina to the Japanese, so they didn't have to invade and fight in Laos, Cambodia, and Thailand, and Vietnam. They just took it as allies of the Germans. The Thais became their allies very quickly and entered into an agreement with them, so they didn't have to invade Thailand either. But they already, since 1937, had occupied very large stretches of the Chinese coastline. They invaded Malaya, and they began moving to the west to drive the British out. In February of 1942, they invaded the Dutch East Indies, which was going to become a source for raw materials for their war machine. Rare metals, ores that they needed for their fighting vehicles, as well as oil, were all in abundance in the Dutch East Indies, and that's why they wanted them. So right at the beginning of the war, into early January, the Japanese were successful in taking a whole swath of the Western Pacific off the table. And then at the same time, they began moving east in a drive to push the United States out of the Pacific, or at least the Western Pacific. They invaded Guam. They took Wake Island in December. And their goal was to create this, what they thought to be an impenetrable barrier that the United States could not get through in order to attack the home islands. The Japanese Army was principally responsible for the war in China. The Japanese Navy was responsible for defending the home islands. And they wanted to push the United States as far away from the home islands as possible to make the home islands immune from attack. So that's a state of affairs that existed in the early part of 1942. The Japanese were confused at this point. They had achieved victories that they didn't expect to achieve as quickly as they did against opponents who weren't ready to fight them. And so they had a number of options available to them, and that's when disharmony erupted among the Japanese General Staff in Tokyo. The Army was quite content to stay on the Chinese mainland. They were interested in driving inland to conquer the Chinese Army and bring down the Chinese government under Chiang Kai-shek. The Japanese Navy, however, saw its mission to protect the home islands. They wanted to drive further out and make this perimeter more impenetrable. A faction within the Japanese Navy thought the best option available was to move into Australia as well. And so with all of these options in front of them, there was a lot of disharmony within the Japanese Navy as to what their next step should be. The architect of successes to this point was Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, who was the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack. And it was under his leadership that the Japanese aircraft carrier force became the prominent force that it was. He was responsible for developing a mobile strike force, which the Japanese called Kido Butai, which was Japanese for mobile strike force, and virtually all of Japan's successes to that point were a result of Kido Butai's presence, because the presence of 6 aircraft carriers with over 300 aircraft gave them instant air superiority over any area in which they appeared. He was still not happy with the results of Pearl Harbor. He knew that sinking 8 American battleships and bringing them out of the war was not enough. And he was plagued continually by the American aircraft carriers that survived Pearl Harbor. They were already beginning to show themselves as a threat to his plans to protect the home islands, because the Lexington, the Saratoga, the Wasp, the Enterprise were all nibbling at the perimeter, making little nuisance strikes along the perimeter of Japanese bases. And he knew that he had to have this one last battle with the United States Navy to remove the U.S. Navy as a threat to the plans that the Japanese had. What he would like to have, what was his plan was a strike through the Central Pacific at Midway Island. Midway is part of the Hawaiian island chain, and he believed that the United States Navy could not tolerate an invasion of Midway and an occupation of Midway Island, which was only about 1,300 miles from Pearl Harbor, that would bring the U.S. Navy out in force. The Japanese, possessing what he believed to be overwhelming power, would dispatch the U.S. Navy, and there would be no threat to the Japanese home island existing in the Pacific any longer, which would give the Japanese the opportunity to carry out these further operations, including occupancy of the United States holdings in the South Pacific, Fiji, Samoa, the New Hebrides, which would cut communication lines with Australia and give the Japanese free hand in conquering the Australians. That was his plan, and a lot of arguments going on into the beginning of April 1942, until one event happened which stopped the debate. On April 18th, 1942, Jimmy Doolittle led a strike of 16 B-25 bombers off the Hornet. They struck at 6 Japanese cities. The Japanese were horribly embarrassed by this, especially the Japanese Navy, whose responsibility it was to protect the home islands. They had avowed to the emperor that there was no way that anybody could strike at the home islands, given the successes that the Japanese armed forces had achieved to this point in 1942. What this did is it galvanized the Japanese thinking. And they realized that now we need to follow Yamamoto's direction. We need to make sure that the U.S. Navy ceases to be a threat to Japanese interests in the Pacific. And they all united behind him. However, they still wanted an invasion of New Guinea as a stepping off point for the invasion of Australia. And they also wanted a strike at the Aleutians to relieve that supposed threat of future attacks from the Aleutian Islands on the Japanese home islands. And so he was given the go-ahead to formulate an attack on Midway, but in a compromise that he made, he gave over 2 of Japan's fleet carriers from Kido Butai. The 6 aircraft carriers that attacked Pearl Harbor would no longer be available to him. You'd only have 4 of those aircraft carriers. 2 would be dispatched to cover the forces that were to attack New Guinea and Port Moresby in anticipation of the Australian invasion. That's important because it weakened the Japanese going into the Battle of Midway. And the early literature that says that Midway was a miracle and an incredible victory, they missed the point that going into Midway, the Japanese were already inferior in power to the U.S. Navy and the forces that existed in Midway. And we're going to explore that in a little bit. Why Midway Island? Midway Island sits about 1,300 miles from Oahu. It's part of the Hawaiian island chain. It's just two islands. The major island, Sand Island, at that time possessed military installations on it. Eastern Island had an airfield. It included facilities for 31 PBY patrol bombers. Midway was an outpost. With Midway there, the Navy could keep tabs on what was happening as far as 700 miles to the west. So it was an important facility for the United States Navy. There was also a small fleet of PT boats stationed there, about 3,600 personnel, almost 1,000 of whom were the Midway Marine Detachment assigned to defend the atoll. The Japanese plan of attack, and why this map is so important, is it shows you the complexity of their plan, which was also a weakness in what their planning was. Many of the early works that were written about the Battle of Midway characterized the Aleutian Force as a northern jaw of a trap to trap the U.S. Navy in between the Aleutian Force and the Midway Force. That's not the case. The Aleutian Force further weakened Japan's ability to deal with the U.S. Navy by removing 3 additional carriers that could have been available to the Japanese and allocating them to the Aleutian Force. The Aleutian Force was over 5 days steaming time from Midway. There's no way that the Aleutian Force could have helped or in any way supported the Midway Force during this attack. So this was a further mistake the Japanese made. One of the critical issues in military strategy is you never divide your forces in the face of your enemy. You keep focused and use massive strength to deal with your opponent. So the Japanese were already slated to lose Midway before they even deployed to attack. They also, instead of one cohesive force, they divided their forces into units. Communication among the Japanese was very poor. The Japanese had difficulty in maintaining reliable communications, and so these units were not coordinated and didn't realize how the battle was progressing at the time that the battle was underway. Just to give you a graphic understanding of the command structure, Yamamoto had overall command of the operation. Beneath him was Admiral Nagumo, who commanded the 4 aircraft carriers that were to strike it at Midway and destroy its defensive capabilities. There was also a guard force under Admiral Takasu. His job was to protect the surface fleet with battleships and cruisers, but he was not in a position to support the aircraft carriers. Admiral Kondo, the Midway Invasion Force, his force was there to shield the invasion force from attack from U.S. surface ships. Admiral Kurita, the close support group that would shell Midway in preparation for landings, and Admiral Tanaka, who was in charge of the transport group. And not shown here is Admiral Komatsu, who commanded a fleet of 15 submarines that were assigned reconnaissance duty and who never showed up on time, and so their value in the battle was nullified as well. But here you can see each of these gentlemen had their own infrastructures to command, and to command a force like this that was so disparate was one of the weaknesses that the Japanese created for themselves. This was the Aleutian Force also was under Admiral Kakuta with 2 light carriers, which could have been made available to the Midway Strike Force, but because of the compromise that Yamamoto negotiated, he lost those 2 carriers as well. This force was never available to the Midway Force. They were too far away to be of any use and help to the Midway Force when it ran into trouble. Part of the Japanese plan called for intelligence to keep tabs on where the U.S. fleet would be. The major assumption and the error that Yamamoto made was he thought the United States would react to the Midway invasion. He didn't anticipate that the United States Navy would be on scene, on site, waiting for the attack. He created 2 means of intelligence, reconnaissance, He ordered that a fleet of 15 submarines be stationed in a cordon along the likely routes between Oahu and Midway Island to detect the U.S. carriers after Midway was attacked, so that they would be prepared to deal with the U.S. fleet as it came up to deal with the Japanese. However, these 15 submarines were late leaving Kwajalein. By the time they got on station, the U.S. fleet had already passed through their station. And so the Japanese never even realized where the Americans were. They also, in the early part of the war, this is a fact that's not generally known, the Japanese continued to attack Pearl Harbor after December 7th. They had these Mitsubishi flying boats, they were called Emily's, that were very long range. And what they would do would be to fly them from Kwajalein in the Marshall Islands to French frigate Shoals, a small atoll north of Pearl Harbor, where they would be met by a submarine who would refuel them, and then they could fly on to Pearl Harbor from there. Several times they did attack Pearl Harbor after the December 7th attack, but before the Midway attack. This was called Operation K. The Japanese intended that these flying boats would be refueled and then overfly Oahu, report back on the presence of the U.S. carriers in the Pacific Fleet, and warn Yamamoto where they were so he would be ready for them after they attacked Midway Island. The problem was, this time around, when the Japanese submarine showed up and the float plane showed up, the United States had already been tired of being attacked from French frigate Shoals, and there was a contingent of U.S. warships anchored there. So when the submarine showed up, it turned around and went home, and Operation K was canceled. Therefore, the Japanese had no intelligence whatsoever on where the U.S. fleet was or would be. Another critical issue in the Battle of Midway.
Herb, that we did have some intelligence on this apparently, because we could decode their messages.
Yeah, we're going to do that.
Good.
We're going to do that.
Sorry.
No problem. If we talk about the opposing strengths, the Japanese did have overwhelming surface ship strength. We had no battleships in the Pacific. Those that weren't sunk at Pearl Harbor had been ordered back to the West Coast. The decision was not to involve them in any combat against the Japanese because our battleships were slow, our carriers were fast, they didn't need to be slowed by the presence of our battleships. The Japanese fielded over 200 ships between the Aleutians and the Midway operation. 11 battleships, 12 cruisers, 47 destroyers, assorted auxiliaries, plus the 15 submarines. That was overwhelming strength, but in surface ships. Midway was to be a battle of air strength, of air power between two opposing naval forces, and that's where it counted. There they wielded 225 aircraft. Would have been more, it would have been over 400 had the two aircraft carriers that had been assigned to the New Guinea operation been present. There, in the two light carriers that accompanied the auxiliaries in the rear of the Midway force were an additional 32 aircraft, but they were so far positioned from the Midway strike force that they couldn't support the carriers either. The Japanese were superior to us in a number of important areas, though. Their aircraft were superior to us. Their weaponry was superior. They had a torpedo that was terribly reliable, a Long Lance, which had proven itself at Pearl Harbor. Their air crews were veterans. Their naval air crew had been fighting since 1937 in China. They were veterans. They knew how to fight, whereas American air crew were still being blooded. Another weakness for the Japanese, however, was their poor search capability. Some authors have postulated because the Japanese were samurai, they believed in the offense, not the defense. And surveillance is a matter of defense. And they didn't put enough support into their surveillance elements in order to identify and find the U.S. fleet. And in World War II aircraft carrier combat, he who found his opponent first was the one who won the battle. And that was part of the problem. The Japanese did not find the Americans first. It was quite the other way around. This is what the strike force looked like. This is actually the Pearl Harbor strike force. Gives you a sense of the size of just the carrier strike force heading into Midway, except they were lacking the Shokeku and the Zuikeku. Both were heavy fleet carriers that were assigned to the New Guinea operation. Well, the Japanese excelled in their naval aviation. They had the vaunted Japanese Zero. There was no fighter in the Pacific that could deal with a Japanese Zero at this time of the war. They had 78. They embarked 78 Zeros on their 4 carriers. 93 Kate attack aircraft that could carry either the Long Lance torpedo, which you see there, or a bomb load for horizontal bombing. And their Val dive bombers, 70 embarked on their carriers. The Val has the notoriety of being the Japanese aircraft responsible for sinking the most U.S. ships during World War II. Now, they also embarked 2 successors to the Val as tests for these aircraft. 2 new dive bombers were on the Soryu. These were to be used for reconnaissance. They were very fast aircraft, and this was going to be their test in combat. And the Japanese were still using biplanes. Their light auxiliary carriers were still using these as their dive bombers, signifying that they didn't intend that these would actually get into combat. On the American side, we fielded 233 aircraft on 3 aircraft carriers, the Hornet, the Enterprise, and the Yorktown. What's overlooked by the early authors who study the Midway battle and why they feel that Midway was such an incredible victory for the United States is they overlook the fact that we had another 95 aircraft on an unsinkable aircraft carrier called Midway Island, which gave us a total of over 300 aircraft, and so we outnumbered the Japanese in aircraft where it was going to count. And we're going to see why not only did aircraft win the battle, but aircraft, their job was to, on the morning of the battle, their job was to find the Japanese fleet. And they flew an arc from 180 degrees to 360 degrees westward, out 700 miles. We had the ability to detect, and we did detect the oncoming Japanese fleet, even though we knew they were coming. We detected their whereabouts, and were able to do that, whereas the Japanese gave very, very light attention to reconnaissance, as we'll see. The problem for us is that we had inexperienced, untried aircrew, which showed itself at Midway. Very few of our aircraft scored hits on the Japanese fleet, and that was principally because our crews were not experienced yet, as were the Japanese. We had an unreliable torpedo design. Oftentimes when they were dropped from the torpedo planes, they broke apart. The planes had to be dropped, the torpedoes had to be dropped at less than 100 feet, at less than 100 knots speed, or else they would break apart when they hit the water. That made our torpedo planes terrible, terrible targets. And it was, and they suffered horribly for these issues of obsolescence. Our torpedo bombers were obsolete by the time the war began. And also our fleet was not deployed with armor-piercing weaponry as were the Japanese. The Japanese had armor-piercing bombs which could go through the deck of an aircraft carrier. But as you'll see when we get into the attack itself, our bombs at 500 pounds and 1,000 pounds had no problems at all getting through wooden carrier decks on the Japanese carriers. Our aircraft, again, the TBD Devastator, which is legendary when you talk about the Battle of Midway. Only 4 TBD crews returned alive out of a force of, between the 3 carriers, must have been about 45 TBDs, only 4 crews returned alive. Our F-4F Wildcat was a great fighter, but our pilots yet weren't schooled in dealing with the Japanese Zero. They had received great experience in the Battle of Coral Sea the preceding month, but deploying those tactics was yet to be done, and it was not something that all of our fighter pilots realized. And up against a Zero, an F-4F Wildcat was not a match. The savior of Midway, of course, was the SPD Dauntless dive bomber. This was the aircraft that won the Battle of Midway for the United States. It was a small, light, well-armored aircraft. It could take an enormous amount of punishment, which we'll see, which was one of the reasons for the Japanese failure. And when you look at the numbers, we deployed 42 torpedo bombers against 112 dive bombers. The U.S. Navy knew what its weapon system was going to be if it was going to defeat the Japanese, and that was the dive bombers. The Army Air Corps wasn't to be left out of the battle. They deployed 17 B-17s at Midway, only 14 of which were operational, and also 4 Martin B-26 Marauder bombers, which were used as torpedo bombers and not as level bombers. The Marines also had a contingent. Marine Air Group 22 was stationed at Midway. They flew obsolete Vindicator dive bombers, the obsolete Brewster Buffalo. They also flew Wildcats, and they did fly SBD Dauntlesses. While I'm showing you that picture, if you ever have the chance to visit the Naval Museum in Pensacola, do make sure you stop and look at this. This is one of the only surviving SBDs from the Battle of Midway. That's on display in the Naval Museum. Also, Midway was a debut of the TBF Avenger. 6 of these aircraft belonged to Torpedo 8 aboard the Hornet, but they were late in arriving. The Hornet had already departed from Midway when these aircraft arrived, and so they were shuttled up to Midway following a Navy PBY, and did participate in the battle, but as land-based aircraft. And of course, as we mentioned before, the PBY Catalina long-range search aircraft, which was one of the saviors of the battle for the U.S. U.S. forces were under the command of Chester Nimitz, who took command of the U.S. Pacific Fleet after Pearl Harbor, and he relieved, my brain just went dead on. Husband Kimmel, who was in charge of the Pacific Fleet at the Pearl Harbor attack. Nimitz had a very compact command. The U.S. carriers were in 2 task forces only because of necessity. Jack Fletcher was just returning from the Battle of Coral Sea aboard the Yorktown, which had taken a severe mauling at the Coral Sea, and was coming back with a carrier that was said to be reparable with 3 months' worth of work. Navy crews at Pearl Harbor put her back in operation in 72 hours, and she was able to join the Hornet and the Enterprise, who had already left under the command of Ray Spruance as commander of Task Force 16. Had the Yorktown been able to, they probably would have left as one task force under Jack Fletcher's command. Midway was a naval air station. It was under the command of Captain Cyril Simard. The Marines were commanded by Harold Shannon, and Lieutenant Colonel Ira Kimes commanded the Marine Air Group. So you see a very compact command compared to the Japanese. One mission: defend Midway and destroy the Japanese. The Japanese had multiple missions: attack Midway, kill the American fleet, occupy Midway, prepare to attack the Hawaiian Islands. Another reason why the U.S. was able to defeat the Japanese. Very focused mission, one purpose involved, which is to destroy the Japanese. many planes headed Midway, which immediately keys Midway to get their aircraft off the ground. At daybreak, they had already launched their B-17s, which at this point were 200 miles west of Midway, looking for the Japanese fleet. All of the aircraft in Midway were launched, including the fighters. Everybody was dispatched to attack the Japanese fleet, except the fighters, which remained behind to protect Midway Island. The Japanese had no problem getting through the fighter defense that we put up. Old Brewster Buffaloes were no match against Japanese Zeros. The pilots were young, inexperienced. They basically were slaughtered by the Japanese Zeros coming in. Between 6:20 and 6:30, the Japanese attacked Midway Island with horizontal and dive bombers. When they broke off their attack and returned, Lieutenant Tominaga, who commanded their strike force, radioed back that the attack had been ineffective and Midway needed a second attack in order to soften it up for any invasion. Nagumo receives that information at 7:15 and in a very controversial move orders that his remaining strike aircraft that are below deck in the carriers have their torpedoes removed and they be changed out for general purpose bombs to be used against land targets. Very controversial, but we're going to see in a minute that it was not an irrational decision. At about the same time that this is happening, Tominaga is radioing back that Midway needs a second strike. Nagumo is ordering that his aircraft be changed to hit ground targets. At just that time, the first U.S. aircraft starts showing up. It's a combined attack of the 4 B-26 torpedo bombers and the 6 TBF Avengers that had taken off at about 6 o'clock from Midway. Only one Avenger makes it back. All of them are shot down by Zeros except for one. But interestingly, the B-26s make their attack on the Akagi, and Admiral Nagumo gets a good taste, and this is what probably feeds into his decision. He gets a good taste of what's coming. He knows that these are all land-based aircraft. And interestingly, two of the B-26s, one is shot down and just barely misses the bridge. And had he been a little bit closer to the bridge, he would have killed Nagumo. And he's shot down and crashes on the starboard side of the Akagi. But another B-26, piloted by Lieutenant Jim Murray, figures the safest place for him to be in the midst of all of this is on top of the Japanese aircraft carriers, because they're certainly not going to shoot at themselves. So he makes a pass at 100 feet above the Akagi's deck, and then hightails it out of the battle zone, and is the only B-26, or he and one other B-26 survive. I love to include in presentations artwork because we never get photographs of this. It would be virtually impossible. And these are two great portrayals of that incident. It's an omen by Jack Fellows, the omen to Nagumo, and shot across the bow by Roy Grinnell, both of them depicting the Suzy Q hightailing it across Akagi's deck at 100 feet above the deck. Now back to what Nagumo was thinking. He's ordered his aircraft below deck to change from torpedoes and ship-killing bombs to land-killing ordnance. Now what was he thinking? Well, we know that Operation K was canceled because the Navy showed up at French frigate shoals. We know that the U.S. carrier fleet had passed through the zone that was being surveyed by the Japanese submarines. As far as he knows, there are no U.S. naval forces, no surface ships in the area, so it's a calculated risk, and he's being attacked by land-based aircraft. So the best thing for him to do is to take out Midway Island once and for all, and that feeds into his decision to go against Yamamoto's strict instructions of keeping half of his force back in case the U.S. Navy shows up. And so begins a period of utter confusion below decks. Unlike the American Navy's doctrine for servicing aircraft was that the aircraft would be serviced on the deck. They were fueled, they were armed on deck. They weren't armed below deck. Below deck was used for maintenance and repair and for storage. The Japanese, however, did not believe in using their carrier decks as air parks. They did all of their servicing, all of their fueling, all of their arming of aircraft below deck. And what you had now was a scene of pandemonium, with Japanese dropping torpedoes off of torpedo bombers and trying to replace them with bombs, which was about a 30-minute task because the torpedo shackles that held the torpedo to the torpedo plane had to be removed to be replaced with bomb shackles, because the bombers that carried torpedoes were also high-level horizontal bombers. And so, and these could not be done all at once. They were done in series of 6. And so you had massive confusion below deck as the Japanese maintenance crews are trying to rearm these aircraft, and they don't have the time to move the torpedoes below deck where they belong in the magazine. Instead, they're leaving them in racks in the hangar deck, which is a disaster waiting to happen. These should have been returned back to the magazine below deck where they've been protected. Instead, they were left in the hangar deck, and they only lent fuel to the fire. Now, going back to where are we in the battle? Remember, at 7:05, Tominaga radios back that Midway needs a second strike. At about 7:05, the first U.S. aircraft show up and start attacking the Japanese fleet. And at 7:15, Nagumo orders that his aircraft be rearmed to attack Midway. Well, at 7:05, in the midst of this, the U.S. fleet begins launching its aircraft. Early that morning, Yorktown had launched scouts to survey the northern sector north of where the U.S. fleet was, so Yorktown was not able at that point to launch its strike. It was waiting for its scouts to return. But in the meantime, Enterprise and Hornet both launched a combined strike of 116 aircraft, knowing where the Japanese fleet was. We already had reports where it was located. American crews were not experienced yet. Our launching of these strikes was a shambles. They would launch the torpedo bombers first. The torpedo bombers would hover waiting for the dive bombers to come up and join up, and then the fighters to come up. All of this consumed fuel, consumed time. It got to the point where the commanders were saying, just go. And so instead of coordinated attacks with torpedo bombers being protected by fighters and dive bombers being protected by fighters, the Enterprise just launched her aircraft to get at the Japanese. Hornet, interestingly, was able to launch a coordinated attack. But that doesn't much matter because of something called a flight to nowhere. And this is a little-known episode that certainly wasn't in the history books when the battle was first chronicled in the early years following World War II. There was a little drama going on the bridge of the Hornet that morning. Mark Mitcher was the captain of the Hornet, and he was sure that the Japanese were employing U.S. carrier doctrine, which meant multiple task forces. So the fact that Japanese carriers were sighted earlier in the day didn't mean that there weren't additional Japanese carriers trailing behind elsewhere, and he was sure that the Japanese had a second task force. The Japanese, from his location, were at 235 degrees. He was sure that the Japanese were at 265 degrees. And so he insisted that his air group commander, Stanhope Ring, launch the air group and go on a bearing of 265 degrees, looking for the Japanese fleet. Ring was fine doing whatever his captain told him to do, but John Waldron, the commander of Torpedo 8, was on the bridge and said, no, if you listen to the communications, you'll know that the Japanese are at 235 degrees. We need to launch and follow a bearing of 235 degrees to reach the Japanese fleet. Well, Mitcher's insistent, and unfortunately wins the day. The entire Hornet Air Group takes off and heads off on a bearing of 265 degrees. And this is what's called a flight to nowhere. Here's the Hornet's launch point, and they're launching out at 265 degrees. At this point, Waldron, and then the man was incredibly brave, as history points out, but he broke with chain of command and he said, I'm not following you. I know where the Japanese are, and I'm going to go after them. He breaks away after trying to get some of his fellow Air Group 8 pilots to follow him, but nobody will. They all want to follow Ring to 265 because that's what they've been ordered to do. He breaks away and heads down to 235. And as we know, that costs him and almost all of his Torpedo 8 pilots their lives. The rest of the Hornet Air Group flies out to nowhere. The battle is occurring down here. None of Hornet's Air Group, except for Torpedo 8, ever engages the Japanese. That's 44 aircraft, 7 fighters, and 37 dive bombers. And the question to today still resonates whether we would have lost the Yorktown if the Hornet's Air Group had participated in the attack, because it was only the carrier Hiryu that escaped the first assault by the U.S. Navy. And had the Hiryu been sunk along with the other 3 carriers, then Yorktown probably would never have been lost. And so that's got to be laid on the shoulders of Mark Mitcher and Stanhope Ring. At about this time, at 7:30, about a half an hour now after the U.S. air groups are being launched from the carriers, Scout 4 from Tone spots a fleet of U.S. cruisers. And you're not going to find a fleet of U.S. cruisers out in the Pacific Ocean without a reason. So it's quite clear that they must be the escorts for carriers. Chikuma's scout should have picked them up earlier, but didn't because he chose to fly above the clouds. The pilot of the aircraft radios back, but instead of radioing back to Akagi that he spotted U.S. fleet units, he radios back to the Tone, his home ship. And it takes about a half an hour for the Tone to communicate that to Nagumo on board the Akagi. So Nagumo gets that information late, and now he's faced with a quandary. There are U.S. surface units here, and I'm in the midst of changing my torpedo bombers to land-based bombers. Now what do I do? Well, he reverses himself again. So now you have this the crews below deck in a sweltering environment, now having to take whatever torpedoes they've removed, put the brackets back on the torpedo bombers, put the torpedoes back on the torpedo bombers, and it's a madhouse down below. The early commentators on the battle make out Nagumo to look like a fool for what he did, but I don't think that's true. I think Nagumo was more of a victim than he was a perpetrator. With what he knew and the attacks that he was experiencing and would experience before the U.S. carriers made their presence known, made his decision probably the best decision he could have made. And really the fault has to be laid on Yamamoto's shoulders, because Yamamoto knew that Operation K had been canceled, and Yamamoto knew that the submarines had left Kwajalein late, so that neither of them would be a reliable source of information on the whereabouts of the U.S. fleet. At 7:55, we're going on to the next hour now, another important element of the battle takes place. The USS Nautilus spots the Japanese carriers. She tries to set up for a firing solution on the carriers, but she can't do it, so instead she fires on the battleship Kirishima in the escort. Well, U.S. torpedoes aren't that good at this stage in the war, and even though he fires a spread at Kirishima, none of them hit and or explode. But what that does, though, is it wakes up the Japanese escorts to the fact that there's a submarine here. It creates more chaos, though, for the Japanese, who are now maneuvering, trying to avoid air attacks and a submarine. And that's not good business for aircraft carriers that are trying to make a course into the wind to launch their strikes. Also, don't forget the Japanese strike from Midway is about to return to the carriers and needs clear decks to land. Nagumo has bitten off way more than he can swallow. Well, the Japanese escorts try and locate the Nautilus. For 2 hours they depth charge her without sinking her. What's important about this, though, is that they leave behind one escort to keep the Nautilus down and keep her from chasing after the carriers and continuing to be a threat. And that's the Arashi. The Arashi is important, those of you who know about the battle, because this is the Japanese destroyer that points the way to the Japanese fleet for the Enterprise Air Group when the time comes for them to locate the Japanese. Arashi stays around for 2 hours. After she's confident that the Nautilus is no longer a threat to the carriers, she hightails it north and creates a road sign for the U.S. dive bombers off the Enterprise where the Japanese carriers are. Those of you who've ever seen the movie Task Force, if you've ever seen the movie Midway, you know the scene where where McCluskey, the dive bomber pilot, the head of Enterprise's air group, looks down and sees it, and his intuition says, he's moving awfully fast, must be for a reason, and he follows the Arashi right to the Japanese carriers. The Arashi is also notorious for another reason, as we'll see when we get through the presentation. A downed torpedo pilot was executed on the Arashi, and his body was thrown overboard after he was tortured and interrogated. We're going to talk about that in a moment. Well, now we're at the 8 o'clock hour. Okay, U.S. aircraft have attacked without any hits and have scrambled the Japanese fleet. The Nautilus has spotted the Japanese and has further created more stress for Nagumo and his escorts. And now at 8 o'clock, the next group of aircraft from Midway arrive on the scene. There are 16 Marine Dauntless dive bombers from Scout Bomber Group 241 under the command of Loft and Henderson. They make their attack on the Japanese, no hits whatsoever. Loft and Henderson is killed in the attempt. Those of you who know about the Guadalcanal campaign know that this is the Loft and Henderson for whom Henderson Field at Guadalcanal was named in August 1942, the following 2 months later. This has a continuing effect of scrambling the Japanese formation, of bedeviling the Japanese Zeros. A lot has been written about how impenetrable the Japanese combat air patrol was. It was not impenetrable. The Japanese pilots, no matter how skilled they were not schooled at dealing with a force of aircraft who were as deliberative as they were in making their attacks on their ships. Plus, U.S. warplanes were much more heavily armored than the Japanese were used to dealing with, and it took a lot more ammunition to bring an American warplane down, which meant that these fighters had to recycle to the carriers repeatedly. Japanese Zeros only carried 60 rounds of cannon ammunition, which was their devastating weapon. But 60 rounds was not enough to destroy every attacking aircraft. So these Zeros had to return to their carriers to rearm and take off. And when you consider that the air attacks were taking place over almost a 3.5-hour period, the effect on these pilots who hadn't slept, who had been in the air in combat, who hadn't eaten, you could see the deteriorating effect this had on the combat air patrol. The Japanese just were not good at defending their carriers. At 8:20, 20 minutes later, the B-17s arrive. This is scary. 14 B-17s flying over, you'd think would be pretty scary, but the Japanese captains were smart enough to realize that if you had a lookout watching for the bomb bay doors opening at 20,000 feet and the bombs dropping, once the bombs drop, now you made a turn. And that's what happened, and the U.S. Air Corps learned you don't bomb ships from 20,000 feet. The B-17s were ineffective in terms of scoring hits, but they continued to scramble the Japanese. The Japanese had to be dealing with rearming aircraft. These ships are making tight turns to avoid these attacks. Armament is rolling over the decks. The crews are having trouble keeping themselves balanced. It's interfering with the smooth change-out below decks of the aircraft. They have to be heading in an easterly direction, which is where the wind is coming from, in order to recover and launch aircraft. And this is all making that virtually impossible for them to do efficiently. 5 minutes later, the strike aircraft. While the B-17s are attacking, the strike aircraft from Midway begin to return. The Japanese had lost 11 of the 106 aircraft, 11 were shot down, 15 were badly damaged, and another 20 were mildly damaged but required repairs in order to be used in any following strikes. That meant that the Japanese were already down almost 100 airplanes in terms of their reserves of aircraft to deal with with the Americans at Midway and the U.S. fleet. At 8:23, about 20 minutes later, Marine Vindicators show up on the scene. And this has the continuing effect of causing more pandemonium. The commander of the Vindicators doesn't feel his pilots are schooled enough in making dive bombing attacks, so they make an attack on, a level attack on the battleship Kirishima without any results. But it continues to create pandemonium in the Japanese fleet, and it continues to feed Nagumo's belief that he has to deal with Midway Island because all of these aircraft are land-based aircraft that he's having to deal with. So his decision is not necessarily bad. At this time, all he knows is there's a fleet of American cruisers out there. The carriers haven't been sighted yet. At 8:30 is the first communication confirming the presence of a U.S. carrier. Tone 4, the scout plane that was 30 minutes late in leaving, spots the U.S. carriers. And at 9:05, about a half hour later, Yorktown has finally recovered its scouts and it launches its strike. So now you've got two waves of carrier aircraft heading towards the Japanese fleet. 9:20 is when John Waldron happens upon the Japanese fleet, and he prepares his 15 aircraft to attack the carrier Soryu. The Vindicator bomber has to fly low, slow, in order to drop its torpedo. There are 15 airplanes in his torpedo squadron. All 15 are shot down. All but one man survives. George Gay is the only pilot who survives. Everyone else has passed, is killed. If we have the time at the end, I have a very brief 8-minute video which pays tribute to the men of Torpedo 8, which is well worth seeing. All this does is it continues to wreak havoc among the Japanese Zeros. They're flying high to get at the B-17s, then they're told that there are torpedo bombers coming in, so they break off and now they're flying low. Each threat that comes in causes them to change their course and their tactics. Plus, the Japanese Zeros don't all have radios. The Japanese don't have good control over their combat air patrol. And they have no ways of communicating except with the Japanese pilots watching these picket ships to see who is making smoke and who's firing their main batteries to see where the attacks are coming from. And being good fighter pilots, what do? They go after airplanes that they can shoot down. They may not be going after the airplanes that they need to be going after in order to defend the fleet. The TBDs are savaged and destroyed. Not one of them returns to the Hornet. It's just some great art which shows the downing of Torpedo Squadron 8. George Gay is the only one who's able to get near enough to the Soryu. He launches his torpedo, but it's ineffective. And he's already trailing smoke. He's been damaged. He flies over the deck and crashes on the other side of Hiryu and hides under some wreckage. Otherwise, he would have been picked up by the Japanese and probably killed. This is what the Japanese fleet looks like at the moment of Torpedo Squadron 8's attack. They should be going east, getting ready to recover the strike from Midway. Instead, they're zigzagging, and carrier doctrine is you show your stern to an attacking torpedo force so that they have less of a target to hit. So that's why they're running away from Torpedo 8, is to present less of a target. This is just disrupting their ability to conduct carrier operations in a way that's effective. The recovery of the strike from Midway occurs between 8:05 and 9:18, during which there are more attacks by U.S. aircraft. So this is creating even more havoc for the Japanese. Plus, the Japanese have to keep the decks clear for their returning combat air patrol fighters that need to be rearmed. And you've got damaged aircraft coming in from the strike. It's just absolute pandemonium. It's not the high level of confidence that the Japanese presented during the early stages of the war that Americans ascribed that these were an unbeatable foe. Nagumo, in the midst of all this confusion, decides that his aircraft should be all recovered. Those aircraft that are able to participate in a strike against the carriers, the U.S. carriers, should be rearmed, and a strike should be launched after 10:30. Very neat, very orderly. Could Nagumo have in fact gone after the U.S. carriers beforehand? That's a question that still haunts historians today. It's possible that he could have just launched whatever aircraft he had available and made whatever strike he could have made against the U.S., but he chose not to because he was following Yamamoto's orders and following Japanese antiquated doctrine of a massive strike with all your aircraft at one time, which was rather hypocritical given the shape that the Japanese were in at this point. And it wouldn't have made a difference anyway because the American strikes were already en route to the Japanese carriers. So even if he struck at the carriers, it wouldn't have changed the outcome. At 9:40, another flight of Devastator bombers comes in under the command of Gene Lindsay from the Enterprise. Same result. Lindsay is killed. Most of his torpedo bombers are shot down. But it has that same effect of disrupting the Japanese ability to take control of their units in a way that is needed in order to launch a coherent attack against the Americans. 10:02 to 10:03. That's the magic moment. That's when the dive bombers from Yorktown, from Hornet and from Enterprise spot the Japanese carriers. Max Leslie commands Bombing 3 from the Yorktown. He goes after the Soryu. Wade McCluskey, who is the air group commander for the Enterprise, takes his about 34 dive bombers and gets them all aimed at the Kaga. The Japanese have 4 aircraft carriers at this point: the Kaga, the Akagi, which is the flagship, the Soryu, and the Hiryu. McCluskey puts all of his dive bombers onto the Kaga, and that's important because had that order stuck, then both the Akagi and the Hiryu would have survived this attack and would have been able to launch attacks against the U.S. fleet. But as we'll see, based on some quick wits on the part of one of McCluskey's commanders, his orders weren't adhered to. This is what the formation looked like right before the attack. Kaga's out on the side trying to catch up with her sisters. Just before the dive bombers attack, Torpedo 3 comes in and under Lieutenant Commander Massey, Lance Massey, comes in and they attack the Hiryu. That's why Hiryu actually was spared. She was under attack from torpedo bombers when the dive bombers made their runs, and so she was left as is, and she survived the first assault. I told you before the Japanese destroyer had executed an American flyer that was one of VT-3's torpedo pilots, Ensign Osmus. He was very cooperative. The Japanese interrogated him, wanted to know what the disposition of the American fleet was. He told them. They took him out on the fantail of the destroyer. They cut off his head and threw him overboard. The captain of the Arashi was hunted down after the war to be prosecuted for war crimes, but he had been killed during the war, and so the matter was ended there. Torpedo 3 makes no hits at all on Hiryu, who continues to evade the Americans. But now we're at the moment of truth in the Battle of Midway. This is what the disposition looked like at the moment that the dive bombers began their runs. Wade McCluskey has targeted the Kaga. At the last minute, Dick Best, one of his commanders of Bombing 3, sees that Akagi has not been selected as a target, so he breaks away from the attack on Kaga and goes after Akagi. Hiryu is dealing with Massey's torpedo attack that we just talked about, and Soryu is being attacked by dive bombers from the Hornet. From the Yorktown. Magic 6 minutes. In 6 minutes, the United States Navy destroys the Japanese carrier force. At 10:22, McCluskey goes after the Kaga. That's Wade McCluskey. Max Leslie goes after Soryu, and Dick Best goes after Akagi. One of the myths of Midway is that the Japanese decks were loaded with airplanes, ready to be launched. They were just about to make their strike on the U.S. carriers. It's nice, poetic literature, but it's not the fact. The Japanese didn't use the Japanese decks were clear when the dive bombers made their attacks, but the effect was the same as if there had been fueled and armed aircraft on the decks, because the Japanese decks were made of wood, and the Americans were using 1,000-pound bombs, which had no problem penetrating the decks and getting into the hangar decks, where there were fueled and armed aircraft waiting to be brought up to be launched after 10:30. We don't have any great photographs of the effect. We have great artwork, though. This is a piece called Midway, the Attack on Soryu by Anthony Sanders. It depicts Leslie's bombing 3 peeling away from Soryu after their attack. Pawn Takes Castle by Tom Freeman. That's Dick Best and his element of 3 aircraft pulling away from the Akagi. Akagi in Japanese was Red Castle, and that's why the name of this painting, Pawn Takes Castle.
That was the command ship, was that the
Yes, Akagi was the flagship for Kido Butai. Nagumi was on that carrier when it was struck. Then we have a number of paintings by just wonderful artists. That's why I include this, because it gives you a great feel for the battle. This is Bill Schoenfeld's Battle of Midway. This is Dick Best again. Many of the artists have focused on Best's attack on the Akagi because it was so dramatic. R.G. Smith, one of the renowned Midway artists, again the Akagi. It gives you a sense of what it was like. I want to show you what the strikes meant on the Japanese carriers. The Kaga was hit 5 times. The wood planking is over the hangar deck, so 2 of the bombs went off in the hangar deck and immediately began uncontrollable fires. The 2 bombs, or the 3 bombs on the forward part of the deck were damaged, did damage, of course. You can't operate an aircraft carrier with a damaged flight deck. So Kaga was out of the battle. She heeled over and came to a stop and started sinking. She sank at 1925 hours. Uncontrollable fires. She had to be from Dick Best. His airplane dropped that bomb. It penetrated, started fires, and that was the end of Akagi. One of his squadron mates dropped a 1,000-pound bomb that hit just to the port side of the rudder. It damaged the rudder, and for the next hours, Akagi was circling without control and on fire. The Soryu was hit 3 times. 3 bombs in the hangar deck started uncontrollable fires. The Japanese also did not have a good damage control philosophy. They didn't purge their aviation gasoline lines of aviation fuel. American carriers did. They purged lines with carbon monoxide to keep the fuel from igniting. The Japanese didn't do that, so these became just ovens. And the planes were exploding, the ordnance on the planes were exploding, the ordnance that should have been in the magazines was exploding, and these aircraft carriers were rendered useless. All that was left was the carrier Hiryu under the command of Admiral Yamaguchi, and at this point Nagumo is getting off the flagship and he's transferring his flag to the cruiser Nagara, and he's out of communication. So Yamaguchi takes it on himself to command the next attack. And he's a gambler. He's not Nagumo. And he decides to send whatever he's got after the U.S. carriers. And so he launches at 12:09, he launches his valves against the Yorktown. He doesn't know who he's up against. Only 1 carrier has been sighted. He doesn't know the Americans have 3 carriers out there. But he does have a sense from the number of aircraft that have attacked the Japanese fleet that he's dealing with more than 1 aircraft carrier. So he orders dive bombers to attack at 12:09. And Yorktown does receive the brunt of the attack. She's hit 3 times. Let me show you those hits. She's hit, one bomb goes off on the flight deck, does negligible damage except for the shrapnel that takes down a fair amount of sailors. Another bomb penetrates the flight deck and goes off below decks, but doesn't do mortal damage. It's this bomb hit that does substantial damage to Yorktown. It goes off below decks, and it damages the uptakes from the boilers. There's no place for the steam to go now, and the ship has to shut down, so she's without power almost immediately and dead in the water. What about Hornet and what about Enterprise? The Japanese never attacked them. At 13:31 hours, 1:30, Yamaguchi launches his torpedo bombers against the Yorktown. In the interim, until these torpedo bombers arrive on scene, the fires have been put out, and Yorktown is making a little bit of headway. And so the Japanese torpedo planes, when they arrive on site, think they're attacking an entirely different carrier because they're sure that the carrier that the dive bombers hit has already been sunk. So they're ready to report that they're attacking a separate aircraft carrier, which is not the case. They're coming in on Yorktown again. At just before 2 o'clock that afternoon, Yorktown's hit by 2 torpedoes. She doesn't have enough power to maneuver. Plus, the Japanese long-lance torpedoes are devastating weapons. They travel at 42 knots, much faster than an aircraft carrier. There's no way that an aircraft carrier can evade a long-lance torpedo once it's properly aimed. She's hit on the port side. She's hit amidships, 2 hits below the waterline. She immediately comes to a halt and she starts to list. Yorktown is doomed. But that's not the end of the battle. That afternoon, knowing that Hiryu is still out there, the Enterprise and the Hornet get off another strike, and at 17:05 hours that afternoon, they hit Hiryu, and Hiryu is likewise, with her sisters, is destroyed and doomed. She takes 4 bomb hits from the SPD Dauntlesses, the heroes of Midway, and that's the end of the Hiryu. That's where we come to Ensign John C. Butler. Butler was a dive bomber in Squadron 3 aboard the Yorktown. Max Leslie would have been his commanding officer. He participated in the morning attack, but we don't know very much about what happened. We do know that none of his bombs hit the Soryu, but he came back that afternoon to attack the Hiryu. And the last thing that was seen was a 0 on his tail shooting him down as he made his dive on the Hiryu. He was killed, posthumously awarded the Navy Cross for valor and gallantry. And the story doesn't end there. The Navy commissioned a destroyer, the John C. Butler, in 1943. John C. Butler, his namesake, goes on to fight at the Battle of Leyte Gulf and is among the destroyer escorts that defend the destroyer escorts off the Battle of Samar, successfully fending off the Japanese fleet. So it's kind of befitting that John Butler's heritage continued into a battle as important as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Here's the damage to the Hiryu. 4 hits on the foredeck, 1 of them in the hangar deck. She's on fire, she's gone. All 4 Japanese carriers, 4 of the 6 that attacked Pearl Harbor, are now gone, mortally wounded and sinking. The battle's not quite over yet. The Japanese, again being samurai, figure even though they have no aircraft carriers, that doesn't mean they can't attack the Americans, and they're hoping for that surface battle that they believed they would win if they came up against the U.S. Navy. So Yamamoto orders heavy cruisers to approach Midway, shell the airfield at Midway, and deal with any U.S. fleet units that they encounter along the way. Well, unfortunately, they don't encounter any fleet units, but they do encounter aircraft from Hornet and Enterprise. They're ordered before the aircraft encounter them, though. The Japanese call off the Midway operation, and the cruiser force is ordered to return and join up with the rest of the Japanese fleet. In doing that, the cruiser Mogami collides with the cruiser Makumo. Mogami's bow is damaged, but Makumo is badly hit in amidships. These 2 cruisers are limping back to join the rest of the Japanese fleet when they're set upon by dive bombers that came from Midway as well as from the Yorktown and the Hornet. The Makuma is sunk. Mogami is badly damaged, and the battle is still not quite over. Even though Yamamoto has ordered a retirement at 2:55 in the morning on June 5th, there are still skirmishes. One of the myths of Midway is that this battle broke the back of the Japanese Naval Aviation Force. That's not true at all. The Japanese pilots were not schooled in damage control, so they were worthless on board an aircraft carrier that was on fire and sinking. So some of the first people off a Japanese aircraft carrier were the pilots. And although the Japanese did lose aircrew during the battle, most of their aircrew were saved. It was actually the battles that followed in Guadalcanal where the Japanese Naval Aviation Force was rendered useless as an offensive weapon for the Japanese.
What they did lose, though, is they lost all their support elements.
Mm-hmm.
All
And
the
their
folks that
aircraft.
maintained the aircraft.
On board the carriers,
Correct.
that's right. As I said, the battle wasn't quite over, and the reason I include this is kind of to show, as good as the American pilots were in hitting carriers, they still weren't quite as veteran as they needed to be. The destroyer Tanakaze was sent to sink the Hiryu if they found it was still afloat. She was attacked by 43 Dauntlesses from the Hornet and the Enterprise and 18 B-17s, not one of which scored a hit. So there was a lot of homework yet to do. I'm not taking away from the U.S. Navy. I'm just saying that as a tribute to the Navy, it was marvelous what our guys achieved, but there was still a lot of work to be done before the Japanese would be defeated. On June 6th through 7th, Yorktown is still afloat, and there's talk about putting her on a tow and bringing her back to Pearl Harbor. But unfortunately, the Japanese submarine I-168 has been ordered to hunt for U.S. fleet elements, and she stumbles on the Yorktown. The Yorktown is being serviced alongside by the destroyer Hayman. The I-168 fires 4 torpedoes. One of them breaks the Hayman's back. She goes down in 8 minutes with 108 crew members. The other 2 torpedoes go under the Hayman, and they hit the Yorktown, and she's doomed. And the Yorktown is lost at Midway, but not from air action, from the action of the Japanese submarine. The final tally, we lose one aircraft carrier, the Yorktown, 1 destroyer, the Hayman, about 150 aircraft destroyed, 307 servicemen lost. The Japanese lose 4 carriers, 1 heavy cruiser. 1 heavy cruiser is sunk, 1 heavy cruiser is badly damaged. That's the Mogami. 248 aircraft destroyed, which includes aircraft that the carriers were carrying that were to be offloaded once Midway had been secured and to be used as a Japanese air base. Factors contributing to Japan's defeat. We've gone through some of these, but it's worth just reiterating. Victory disease. The Japanese committed the cardinal sin. They underestimated their adversary. They believed, based on the experience that they had achieved in the first 6 months, that the Americans were not a worthy adversary. Matter of fact, they believed that Americans were morally corrupt and lacked the focus and the strength, the moral commitment that the Japanese possessed, which was quite the opposite of the truth. And so their leaders as well as their soldiers were victims of victory disease. There were cultural considerations as well. Nobody would dare question the orders of Admiral Yamamoto. And in early May, when he had war games aboard his flagship, he was challenged by some of his staff. What would happen if the Americans are already there at Midway waiting for us? And his answer was, don't worry about it, Admiral Nagumo will deal with them. Well, he did, and he lost. So the Japanese had the opportunity to build contingency plans to deal with an American fleet that was already on site, but they decided, because of victory disease, to disregard taking that seriously. As we said before, their intelligence was very poor. Ours was exceptional. Operation K never took place. The Japanese submarine cordon never was deployed on time. The Japanese had no idea that American fleet units were in the vicinity until it was too late. They also failed to learn from prior experience. The Japanese had gone into the Indian Ocean in February and March to attack Ceylon and try and push the Royal Navy out of the Pacific. At one point in their adventure into the Indian Ocean, 9 British Blenheim bombers flew over and attacked the Akagi before she even knew they were there. None of them scored a hit on the Akagi, but the Japanese should have known from prior experience that they had a problem detecting aircraft that were coming in to attack them. And they made no attempt in the following months to compensate and correct for that. They underestimated our carrier pilots. They thought because of experience they'd had with them that our carrier pilots were not skilled, were cowardly. They would not drive home their attacks the way Japanese carrier pilots did. They should have known better. At the Battle of Coral Sea, the Japanese not only lost the carrier Shoho, the light carrier Shoho, but 2 of their fleet carriers that were loaned to the Japanese for that but were loaned by Yamamoto to that operation, were badly mauled. Shokeku received 3 bomb hits, and the air crew off Suikeku was so badly devastated by the American pilots that she had to go back to Japan and refit with an entire new air group and couldn't participate at Midway. So the Japanese had fair warning that given an American force that was ready to deal with them, they had better not take for granted the skill set of the American Navy. These 2 carriers were not available to them as a result of the Coral Sea, the Shokeku and the Zuikeku. Shokeku again was hit by 3 dive bombs, and Zuikeku lost most of its air contingent and had to go back to Japan to resupply. Another inherent feature in the failure of the Japanese was their carrier design. You can see this is the Akagi. The Akagi was built off of a cruiser hull, or I'm sorry, that was a battleship hull. They built a large superstructure upon which they could put a flight deck, but they didn't put any ventilation systems. There were no hangar decks, no hangar doors that would allow for ventilation. And what that created was a sealed tomb. If bombs came through and found the conditions that the Japanese experienced during the Battle of Midway, this would become an oven. American carriers, on the other hand, were designed with hangar doors. The Japanese didn't put hangar doors on because they wanted to insulate the maintenance crews from inclement weather. The American doctrine was just the opposite. They wanted good ventilation. They had ventilation doors all along the sides of our carriers. These are closed here, but you can see it open here. The purpose for those was to create good ventilation so the crews had some fresh air coming in, but also if the ship was hit, these would create opportunities for supporting ships to come alongside and assist in fighting the fire. And so American damage control was far superior to Japanese damage control and the design of their aircraft carriers. As I said, they had insufficient damage control. Their feeble early warning system, they used their cruisers, destroyers, and battleships in a distant ring around their carriers to fire off main batteries to warn if they saw airplanes coming in to attack. Americans had radar, and they had direction finders that allowed the aircraft carriers to direct fighter cover to the points where they were needed to defend the carriers against an attack. The Japanese Zero was not as vaunted as the Japanese Zero was advertised to be. It didn't carry self-sealing weapons tanks. The pilot and gunner sat in an armored tub. It was harder for a Japanese fighter to bring down an American aircraft than it was some of the other aircraft they've been up against. That's a picture of Jiro Horishikoshi, who was the designer of the Japanese Zero. And poor communication capability. The Japanese Zeros didn't carry radios to communicate with their ships. And also Yamamoto had failed to keep Nagumo informed that Operation K had been scrubbed and that the submarines were late going on station, so that he couldn't rely on silence as is good as a rationale for assuming there were no U.S. fleet units available. We're going to wrap it up. I'm probably a little bit over my time, but as I said at the beginning of the presentation, Midway, the Battle of Midway has been the subject of over 60 books. And it's interesting if you're trying to detect the fact from fiction, piecing these books together. And really the books are a product of the time when they were written. Those written at the very time of the battle were of course lauding American prowess and capability, and were building morale for the American public. After the war, Mitsuo Fushida, who was the leader of the attack on Pearl Harbor, wrote a scathing book about the Japanese defeat at Pearl Harbor, which, because it was written by Fushida, who was a commander in the Japanese naval aviation group, was taken as gospel. And so for the years following Fushida's book, a number of books came out that talked about how this was all Nagumo's fault and how he was just a poor strategist, and this was the result of his inept leadership, when in fact that wasn't totally the case, as I hope you've seen. A number of movies have been made about Midway. Probably the finest on the spot is the Battle of Midway, which was filmed by John Ford, who was actually on Midway at the time the battle took place. And interestingly, he had a crew on board the Hornet that had nothing to do but document what the Hornet was doing during the battle. And they put together an 8-minute video of Torpedo 8 and of the crew, which was put together by then Admiral Mitcher at the end of the war, and given to the families of the 15 crews that were killed on Torpedo 8. And in 1954-55, Waldron's widow made known the fact that this film existed. And I've got the film, and if we have time, I'm ready to show it to you if you've got the time to. It's only about a 7-8 minute film, and it's worth seeing. But that's an excerpt from it. But you can get the Battle of Midway on YouTube. Just Google it, and it'll come up. It's about a 45-minute film, and it's a fabulous tribute to the guys who fought there. But it also is kind of it's a depiction of American culture that doesn't exist anymore. Those of you who are like me, who live in the past, you want to see this. It's an America that doesn't exist any longer, and the heartfelt script that was written, and the images you'll see, really, it's worth pulling up on your computers and watching. There's a picture of John Ford with the Marines at Midway. Later on, 1944, 20th Century Fox comes out with A Wing and a Prayer. Dana Andrews, Don Amici. Although it doesn't talk about Midway, it's an interesting chronicle about the events leading up to Midway and why the American Navy wasn't visible and why they were trying to trap the Japanese into an all-out battle. A little bit better film is Task Force with Gary Cooper that came out in 1949, which treats the Battle of Midway with some detail. The Japanese also issued a movie called I Bombed Pearl Harbor. It's principally about Pearl Harbor, but the last third of the movie is about the Battle of Midway, and the star of the movie dies in the Battle of Midway as well. He probably did. Then the major film on Midway came out in 1976 from Universal, one of those large extravaganzas that Hollywood was putting out. Not factually terribly accurate, and some of the war footage isn't that great, but it's a good story about the battle. A hidden jewel about Midway is War and Remembrance, which was made for TV. I think the second or third disc is the Battle of Midway. Robert Mitchum plays Pug Henry. His son, Warren, is a dive bomber pilot who's killed attacking the Mogami or the Mikuma the following day after the carrier battle. But some terrific air scenes between Mach Zeros and Dauntlesses, well worth seeing. And then Robert Ballard went out hunting for the Yorktown. He was actually looking for the Akagi, but he stumbled on the Yorktown. And so National Geographic chronicled his finding of the Yorktown. It's a good companion book if you don't want the video but want the book. It's excellent about how he found it and the history of the Battle of Midway. Conclusions: America needed very badly a decisive victory over a seemingly undefeated enemy. That thought contributes heavily to why early books on the subject came out talking about an incredible victory or a miracle at Midway. It really wasn't so much a miracle. The Japanese couldn't have won that battle the way they fought it, and the Americans were well prepared to win the battle, and they fought it correctly. Midway, however, and Coral Sea demonstrates how demonstrated inherent Japanese weaknesses that were finally unveiled when the Japanese came up against an opponent that was fully ready to deal with them. And in the final thoughts, the very aircraft carriers that the Japanese failed to sink at Pearl Harbor and afterwards were the cause of the Japanese defeat at Midway. That's Life magazine cover that shows the Torpedo 8 crews, all but George Gay were killed at Midway. They were all shot down. And that concludes the presentation. If we have the time, I'd be glad to roll.
Well, I've got an idea here, but thank you. I have one question for you, and what we'll do is we'll do this as kind of a two-parter. Some of us are going to stay for the rest of the story, but what I would like to do is just offer that to the group. We'll carry on with what he's got left over. But I wanted to go ahead and I wanted to present something to you, but I had a question first. The Japanese went to a great amount of effort to design their attack on Pearl Harbor. I mean, there were months and months and months of planning. Well, they also did a lot of filming during that attack. And where are most of those films?
Good question. And I don't have a good answer.
I think it's on the Akagi, because it never got back to Japan. When you see some actual battle footage of the attack on Pearl Harbor, that was what limited supply was left over that they could get, because all the filming that they actually performed during that attack is at the bottom of the Pacific. And with that, before we get on to the second part of it, did you have any questions? Anybody else with questions? We have a Battle of Midway survivor. And,
No, I was on Midway in '52.
In '52. Okay, well that's almost as
I'm not that old.
But I would like to present, and our club would like to present this to you
Wow.
for your time and your effort.
Thank you so much.
And your name is not complicated, so
No,
it's easy to spell.
it's not. But let me, for those of you who want to see it, it's 7 minutes and some seconds. Got it queued up
I have a
here.
quick question,
Yeah.
and I should know the answer to this, but it said Yamamoto died in '43,
Yes.
so I should know why, what happened.
He was, that is another great presentation at another time maybe, but the short answer is because the United States had broken the Japanese code, they were able to identify an opportunity where they knew Yamamoto, who was making a tour of forward bases in the Solomons, including Bougainville, where he was going to be. And a flight of Army P-38s, long-range fighters, were dispatched to ambush him. He was exactly where he was supposed to be, and he was killed by... there's still a debate over which pilot actually brought him down, Barber or Lamphere. But the P-38s brought Yamamoto down and
And
killed him.
wreckage is still there.
Yeah, it's still in New Guinea.
Who took
Or
his
on
place?
Bougainville. Not Ozawa. It might have been Ozawa. No, it might have been Ozawa. I'll look that up and I'll email you the answer.
Okay.
Any other questions? If not, go ahead and let's do the other part of it. And thanks again for your time, and you
My
guys
pleasure.
come from the other side of the world here.
Let's see how this is without the mic.
Bill, did you have a charger for this?
Not sure where the speakers are.
Do you have speaker plug-ins? Because we have those speakers there.
I'm going to try it. So here's. Are they on? We'll go with this for the meantime. Get the effect. Now that's torpedo 8. That's half of them. Those are half the pilots and half their rear gunners on the other half. You can see this on YouTube also. That's the TBDs. You can see the torpedo they carry underneath. These were the actual launches. None of these guys came back.
This is actual film of their takeoff.
And they got a Dauntless in there somehow. Somebody misedited, but that's a Dauntless dive bomber taking off. This is John Waldron, the commander of Torpedo 8. There he is on the right. These guys would have been all in their late teens, very early 20s, 19, 20, 21.